this afternoon at Mark Crichton's house, and this is the 12th of January, 2011. I, Guthrie Ford, with Mark, interviewing John Thompson. And the topic today is John Thompson's involvement with the Boy Scouts, Port Aransas, Texas. Good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to start with an overview of your involvement with the Boy Scouts in order to educate our audience a little bit about the organization of the Boy Scouts, because I believe that you're involved with young boys from an early age through their teen years. And if you could tell me your different levels of involvement with the different names of the Scout organizations, it would give the audience a little understanding of how the Scouts are organized.
All right. Could mention that the first thing that ever happened to me with Boy Scouts is when I had just gone to work out at the university in 1960, and Roy Pollock and Dennis Dreyer came out and asked me if I wouldn't, they didn't have a scoutmaster in Port Aransas, would I be interested in being a scoutmaster? And I was astounded to be asked, and thought it was funny, and told those poor guys that they couldn't have found anybody that had less interest in working with scouts than me. I was a bachelor, and I just had the keel laid for a 34-foot sailboat over in Aransas Pass that I was building on, and that I don't know who recommended me, but they were mistaken, and so they left. And nothing ever happened with me on scouting until 1970. And Benton Carey, who was then the executive, professional scouting executive for the Mustang District Scouting, which Port Aransas at that time was a member of the Mustang District. And now, of course, they're a member of the Hoop and Crane District. But Benton Carey came over to organize scouting in Port Aransas. And the first thing that Benton did was to have a meeting down at the elementary school, which my wife Jane and I attended, to organize a Cub Scout pack in Port Aransas. And I was the chairman of the first Cub Scout pack that we organized at that time. And the Cub Scouts were the boys that, at that time, the Cub Scouts were the boys in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. It's changed since then. Presently, Cub Scouts refers to boys in the 1st through 5th grades. Then, and so far as the pack was concerned, my involvement was as the chairman, and then the next year I was the Webelos leader, and then over the years I was the Webelos leader off and on for well over 30 years. I would generally be the Webelos leader, and if we had a father who had a boy in the Webelos and the father wanted to do it, I'd step aside and he'd do it, and then I would do it later until some other father came in. So I probably did it about 20 years out of that 30.
Now, could you go over for people who don't understand what Webelos are? Where does that fit in the transition from
the way it is? I think let's just talk about the way it is now, so it's not too confusing. But the 1st grade boys are what they call Tiger Cubs now, and then when they get into the 2nd grade, they're Wolf Cub Scouts. They have a wolf den. The dens comprise the pack. 3rd grade boys are Wolf Cub Scouts. They're working on their wolf badge. And 2nd grade boys are, and the 3rd grade boys then are the Bears. And nowadays the Webelos program is a 2-year program, and it's 4th and 5th grade boys that are Webelos. And usually you have a man to be the Webelos leader, whereas quite often the leaders for the dens are women. And then the Webelos, after they finish the 5th grade, then they can graduate or transfer to the Boy Scouts. And then the Boy Scouts, separate organization, they're called a troop, not a pack. Boy Scouts, Troop 29 in Port Aransas, primarily made up of junior high school boys. And I never was Scoutmaster in Port Aransas. I was assistant Scoutmaster most of the time, and quite often. But and on the Boy Scout committee. Also, it happens that in Port Aransas, the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts are both sponsored by the McDonald Foundation, and I was chairman of the McDonald Foundation up until last month. So I was involved in that way.
John, in this organizational study, this organizational meeting occurred in 1970.
Yes.
You said. Prior to 1970, can you give us an idea of what the scouting motion or the scouting activities were on Mustang Island?
I can tell you a little bit about that. You know, it's funny. I was once asked, back when we had a Lions Club in Port Aransas, I was asked to give a presentation on the Scouts, and I got up and made a mistake. The first thing out of my mouth was to say, when we organized the Scouts in Port Aransas. Well, boom, up jumped somebody and says, John, we had Scouts in Port Aransas long before you were ever here. So yeah, there was a lot of great scouting activity in the old years. Before my time, there was a lot of great scouting activity in Port Aransas off and on. It was one time, every single boy in Port Aransas that was eligible to be in the Boy Scouts was a member of Troop 29. And I think they told me that originally they met in some building down there on the old Army installation that was half covered with a sand dune, and they'd crawl in the window of the building or the ammo dump or whatever it was and have their meetings in there. And then they, I guess about the 50s probably, what we used to call, at least, the old Boy Scout hut was built, and it was primarily built by Ted Matthews built that. And but in 1970 or 71, when we got started, the only use that was being made of that building was for the AAA, where Alcoholics Anonymous was having their meeting in there once a week. So they had to, when we got the Scouts going, they had to kind of move their stuff aside so we could convert it back to Scouts. So for whatever reason, the scouting had really was just absolutely dead until Benton Carey came over and we had this organizational meeting and really got the Cub Scouting off with a real bang. And then following that, a year later, we organized the Boy Scouts Troop 29.
Other than the Boy Scouts existing in the early days, was there a Cub Scout program in the early days?
Yeah, there were Cub Scouts. I don't know much about it. I looked up the registrations once and discovered, I can't remember this man's name, but he later went on to be football coach at Texas A&M and Mississippi State. But was it
Jackie Sherrill? Jackie Sherrill?
Maybe that was it, or Henry Ballard. Yeah, I don't know, but when I looked this up, it was a long time ago, and he had a long time since, so it does go way back. But he definitely was a football coach for several years at Texas A&M. And
what's the connection? I missed the connection. This guy was connected to Mustang Island?
he lived here and was a Cub Scout Cub Master. He was the Cub Master here back in. So I can't remember specifically when.
As far as you know, 29 has been the number of the troop and pack all the way through?
Troop 29 they saved that number, even though there was no troop here. They saved 29 and pack 29. They saved that for here, and then in 70, 71 we got those going, and there for at least 35 years it was been continuous without any break in registrations. In the last few years, I think there has been a couple of breaks, but we made at least 35 years there without a break continuously. And I'm sure if there's no Troop 29, at least I should hope they'll save that number for Port Aransas.
Well, back on track, your involvement starting with that important Benton meeting in 1970, your focus seemed to be on the Weeble level of scouting.
Well, the Webelos level or the pack, because I enjoyed being the Cub Master as well. I was Cub Master as well as Webelos leader. So I was really Cub Master more than Webelos leader, because I was almost always Cub Master, although a couple of times we did have, I think Russ Maget was a Cub Master for a year or two, and Jimmy Cole was a Cub Master for a year or two. And the first Cub Master when we organized was a fellow named Ray Carlberg, who was in the Coast Guard here. He was married to the daughter of Bonarito that had the ice house back in those days.
What would you like to tell us about the Cubs and the Weebelos?
Well, I think we had a darn good Cub Scout pack in Port Aransas. I think we had an exemplary Cub Scout pack, and we did a lot of things. One thing, a fellow named Ron Musial, who was mate on the Longhorn, built a 6-track Pinewood Derby track for the pack, where the boys raced with these little wooden cars that they make. And I've seen a lot of those tracks. Jane and I went to Philmont and took the Cub Scout leader training in Philmont earlier on in our involvement. We saw the tracks out there, and I've seen them all around, and there's never been one as good as the one that Ron Musial made in his lunch hour in the shop down at the university, and it's still around, and they still do use that, what is it? Almost 40-year-old track, I guess. Another thing that we used to do that was make plenty of money, so that money was never, of course we were sponsored by the foundation, and the foundation always played the recharter, but there's a lot of funds required to run a pack like that, and we always wanted every boy in Port Aransas to have a uniform. So we had an annual spaghetti dinner in Port Aransas, and the boys would sell tickets, and we'd have prizes for the boys that sold the most tickets, and prizes like a bicycle. And one year the IGA donated one of these little motorized cars, and the kids really sold a lot of tickets. And we'd make a couple of $1,000s out of that. We did a lot of special events, and one time Charlie Zahn and I and some others took all the kids down to the zoo down in the valley, the Gladys Porter Zoo that's down in the valley. And unfortunately, one of the vehicles was a big motor home that had been borrowed, and we didn't know that it had an exhaust leak. And when we got to the first stop outside Kingsville, they transferred one of these boys from there, from that motorhome that was getting kind of ill, to my van. And I hadn't gone more than 10 miles before he just threw up all over himself and all over my van. And by the time we got to the valley, we pulled in down there at the Gladys Porter Zoo, and they gave us a nice big air-conditioned room. We had about 15 or 20 boys that had been in that motorhome, and we carried them all out of the motor home, lined them up around the walls, and determined that they weren't fixing to die anytime soon. But we had to wait about an hour before they revived sufficiently to go look at the zoo. Another thing, interesting story, I guess you'd call it, was sometimes our Port Aransas boys are even more energetic than the average kid, I think. And I think it was Russ Maget and I took the kids to the Goliad State Park, And, you know, there's a lot of different things they can do, and we couldn't be with every group all the time. And those kids just got really pretty much wild. And there had some little old lady there that ran a park, and boy, she latched onto me and chewed my posterior out no end about the behavior of these kids. And I was so traumatized from her chewing me out that I came out of the building, and it's one of the buildings down there, it's a church or a mission. And you know, on some of them they'll have saints up on the roof, little statues of saints. And I came out of there, and I was so used to how wild my kids were. I happened to look up and I saw those saints there, and before I realized it was not a Cub Scout from Port Aransas, I was yelling at that saint to get down off the roof. Usually, to offset that, I do have a letter in my file somewhere that someone wrote me because they could not believe how well behaved my Webelos were when I took them down to the Port Aransas swimming pool, and we did our aquanaut down there at the swimming pool. So it wasn't always that bad. Oh yeah, I always took the Webelos. You know, the Webelos get to go camping, and I always took 2 or 3 camping trips a year. And one of those camping trips, we'd always go up to my ranch, and I don't know how many times we would run across rattlesnakes. And one time something happened that was so good that I had to write it up. I wrote it up and sent it to Scouting Magazine, and it was published in Scouting Magazine. And we decided to take the boys on a night hike. All the kids got their flashlights, and we went out and we'd gone a ways, and we came on a rattlesnake. And you know, some boys sometimes they just don't think. And this snake ran off into the grass, tall grass. And here goes a couple of Port Aransas Webelos right after that snake into the tall grass in the dark. But before I could think, that I was just astounded. Before I could think or do anything, here's this one little Webelo, has his head on straight, and it was Warren McCall. And Warren yells out, "Hey guys, wait." He says, "You are not watching this on TV. This is real life. This is really happening." You know, and these kids suddenly think, "Oh yeah, that's right. If this snake bites me, I'm going to die." Oh yeah, I'll tell you one more. Shrine Circus. We had a habit of every year we would go to the Shrine Circus, and all the men in Port Aransas who are Shriners, you know, when they have that Shrine Circus, they send everybody their tickets, and they have to buy so many. Well, the Shriners in Port Aransas every year, they would give their tickets to the Cub Scouts. And if they didn't have enough tickets for every Cub Scout, they had a couple people in town, Bill Ellis and a few others, that would write a check and make up the difference so that every boy could get to go to the Shrine Circus. And it was an annual event. We did it every year, and we always required that if they wanted to go to the Shrine Circus, they had to be regular in attendance and not just join for that. I think I threw a couple of them off the bus that sneaked in because they had just thought all they had to do in scouting was to go to the Shrine Circus free. But one time we got down to the Shrine Circus, and this is the truth. I was sitting there in the stands, and I had not missed him. But one of our kids had disappeared, and so help me, he went out on the rings there where the circus was going on, and was climbing up the ladder where the high wire act was. And I had to go running down the stands and go up there and reach up and grab that kid by the leg and persuade him to come down off the high wire. So, yeah, we had a lot of fun.
You did some Christmas caroling too.
Yeah, that was another tradition that we had, was to do Christmas caroling here. We would keep a list of really some elderly people and shut-ins, and update it. By the next year, 2 or 3 may have died, but we'd add some more, and we'd go around town, and that was a really good tradition that we carried on.
Do they still do that?
Not that I'm aware.
That's too bad. We've heard about the zoo trip. That's a good story with the carbon monoxide leak and the Goliad Saints, the Flying Saints. Tell us about the Confederate Air Force.
We did. I think maybe we just went down to the valley, and we may have lumped that in. I don't know if we lumped that in with zoo or not, but we did go down there to see the Confederate Air Force. I just remember we stayed there at a Girl Scout camp, which I was amazed that the Girl Scout leaders, main thing they were interested in, that we all backed our cars into the parking lot, so in case they had apparently built their camp in a flood zone, and so in case there was a big flood, and that we wouldn't have to back out and we could go straight out. I thought, well, those Girl Scouts have really got their act together with that. That's all I remember about the Confederate Air Force, except though that later that I learned out, oddly enough, I was going over to the lighthouse, and that was an event that we used to do too. Is our Webelos every year? I would take the Webelos over to Charles Butt's lighthouse, and Rick Pratt would work with us on that. And one of the fathers that was going over there, and then I was telling him about going to see the Confederate Air Force, and he told me that he had been one of the mechanic volunteers on the Confederate Air Force and got one of their B-29s working for them. And we used to have a lot of fun going over there to that lighthouse, because Rick Pratt or whoever else was helping me with it, with boats, we'd always agree beforehand that we were going to fake a race, and the kids wouldn't realize that we already had this worked out. But when we'd be going over there with 2 boats, we'd start racing, and we let one wind going over and one wind going back, and the kids would just get so excited you wouldn't believe it. A couple of times we pulled into the lighthouse over there, and Rick Pratt came out in his kilt with his Scottish bagpipes and played for us as we came into the landing. One time, well after we'd been over to the lighthouse, Rick told me, he says, "John, I don't know about the Webelos coming over to the lighthouse. He says, do you know what happened?" I said, "No, I don't know, Rick." He said, "Well, you know that you had some boys go up to the top of the lighthouse." "Yeah, we always like to go up to the very top of the lighthouse." Well, what had happened is the kids had gathered up all these fiddler crabs, and they took sacks of fiddler crabs with them up to the top of the lighthouse. Well, they were throwing those fiddler crabs down to see them bounce, you know, when they hit. And well, I didn't think that was really the scouting thing to do, and I stopped that, and so the kids stopped it. But they left their fiddler crabs up there in the lighthouse, and that was a time when it was really hot weather, and Rick was not going up into the top of the lighthouse until a couple of weeks later. So when he got up there, those fiddler crabs had been stinking for a couple of weeks. He never got it cleaned up.
You have something on this line about the cave.
I guess just that, well, we went to several caves. I remember Russ Majay being one that took the whole busload down to the was it Natural Bridge Caverns, and I took the boys to another one called the Cave Without a Name. But I don't remember too much about that really.
Oceanography, John, is ahead of the topics that you've been talking about. Is that something you're saving for a little bit later, or is that you want to talk about some of the important functions that your boys did? Some of the merit badges they earned?
Well, I think I have that down to talk about Oceanography Day.
Right.
And the funny thing is I can make a little connection for us here between Oceanography Day and the history of the Boy Scouts in Port Aransas. Because I didn't find out about one of the early scoutmasters in Port Aransas until I had Oceanography Day. We had there was a fellow that went through the university before my time. His name was Tom Hellier. And he's Dr. Tom Hellier. He worked his entire career as a professor at the University of Texas, Arlington. And Tom became a big volunteer scouter. I think he has the record for doing more training of Boy Scout leaders than anyone else. Tom would bring his classes down to the university. And when we started having this Oceanography Day that I'm going to tell you about, Tom volunteered to help with Oceanography Day. And he told me, he says, well, John, don't you realize that I used to be the scoutmaster at Port Aransas? And so Tom Hellier was a scoutmaster here for like 2 or 3 years in Port Aransas while he was working on his PhD. And that would have been in the late 50s.
Wow.
And he went on after that to be a volunteer and he was on the staff where he would spend his summers out at the Philmont Scout Ranch and training Boy Scout leaders. So when we had Oceanography Day, he would volunteer and he would fly down from UT Arlington to help us with Oceanography Day. So maybe if I can tell you a little bit about Oceanography Day, because that was not something that was really put on by the troop here. That was done by the staff out at the Marine Science Institute. And we held that every 2 or 3 years for about 25 years. It was first held back when Johnny Holland was the scoutmaster of Troop 29, and he was trying to get Troop 29 up to a little higher level. And at that time, my brother had a real going scout troop over in Corpus, and we decided to get the 2 troops together, and that troop in Port Aransas would go over to their meetings in Corpus to see how the big boys did it. And there was a lot of camaraderie there between the 2 troops and the leaders. And Johnny was an oceanographer, and he conceived the idea, well, gee, why don't we let these boys all earn their merit badge in oceanography? So we had the 2 troops together, and we had a special day out there, and Johnny worked with them on all the requirements for the Oceanography Merit Badge. And that was the origin of Oceanography Day, in which he and some others held another year. And after that, I was the chairman of Oceanography Day. In that program, it was widely publicized. Some people up in Houston got onto it and promoted it up in the Houston area, so we would have sometimes as many as 100 or 200 kids just from Houston alone that would come down for Oceanography Day. And we raised funds for Oceanography Day so that it didn't cost a boy a penny. But they had to qualify to come to Oceanography Day. It was done on a boy basis and not a troop basis. And I had learned from the first couple of times that they did Oceanography Day, that these are boys, and they junior high school, and they can get kind of wild sometime. And you have a whole troop of them and they're all their buddies, they can particularly be wild. So I got the idea we just do it on a boy basis. So each boy had to individually correspond with me and be approved before he got to come, which meant he had to do all the written requirements for the oceanography merit badge, and they're pretty extensive. And so I did a couple of thousand of those, and some of them, you know, a little 12-year-old boy in the 6th grade, they might not done much, but if his heart was in the right place, he'd get approved. But it was unbelievable. Some of those high school boys, they would send in those requirements that done so well they could have submitted them for a college paper. They were so good. Reminds me that among the first of them that I ever got in, one of the questions was, what is the location of plankton in the food chain? And this kid was trying to fake it without having read the book. And when it said food chain, he must have been thinking about H-E-B. And he said, well, I think they probably sell it somewhere between the produce department and the meat department, you know. So anyway, the way we did it is those boys had to finish all those requirements, and then we approved them. Well, then we approved them to come, and we had a schedule made out. This is all done with the volunteers of the staff of the Marine Science Institute. Most of the faculty and a number of the students would all volunteer. And we'd have a schedule made out where these boys didn't have a chance to do anything but be doing oceanography day. And we split them all up. So if you had 5 boys would come from the same troop, they all had a different schedule. So we'd have groups of 20 boys together, and none of them knew the other boys unless by accident I had made a mistake in the schedule. And the scoutmasters, of course, we just get them to volunteer as leaders, and we'd hand them a written assignment so everybody had something to do. And so we never had any of these problems that you sometimes have with the kids being more interested in running and lollygagging instead of being serious. We didn't have that because the kids didn't come unless they were interested in oceanography seriously, because it was too doggone much work. But then after they got here, they had a real good time. They got to go out on a research vessel, and they would do, while they were here, they would do their project, which was to build a plankton net and use it. They would get that done, and then after Oceanography Day, they'd write a report, and they would send that report to me, and that would complete it. So,
Did you use just the Katy or other vessels?
well, we used the Longhorn.
Oh,
We used the Longhorn and the Katy both, and I would have as many as a half dozen scoutmasters assigned just to being down there on the dock and getting the boys all lined up, getting them all put in life jackets and safely aboard the ships and off the ships and going out on the boats. Because, yeah, we'd have 350 or more boys there, and we got every one of them out for at least an hour on the boats. And of course, that's what they love to do, is to go out on the boats.
So Oceanography Day was instituted by the Marine Science Institute.
Yeah, it was
their program.
It was an official function of the University of Texas, approved by the president of the university, and put on, and with funds raised and provided through the university. One of our big supporters was Perry Bass, and he would write us a check every year to help finance that.
And was it open to youths other than members of the Boy Scouts of America? Were other educational opportunities there for kids? Or?
No, this was strictly a Boy Scout thing, and strictly on the Oceanography Merit Badge. And a couple of times people asked me why didn't I do the same thing for the Girl Scouts. You know, the Girl Scouts didn't have an Oceanography Merit Badge. Finally, something was done for the Girl Scouts, but it had to be entirely different because you couldn't have the same program. They didn't have the same material.
Okay. Pinewood Derby, have you already
Yeah, I think
covered
we've
that
talked about that.
with the slot racing?
Yeah.
On, one of the things you alluded to was that Weeblos is when you start camping. And then when you get into the scouts, that's the hook that keeps a lot of kids going.
Right,
One of the things that always impressed me was the trailer. When did you first come up with a trailer? And you've always been known as having an enormous van to hold a lot of kids.
Yeah, we first got the first trailer. There's been two. The first trailer was back when Doyle Grundy was a scoutmaster, and David Grady was assistant scoutmaster, and the Jerry McDonald Foundation paid for that trailer. In fact, it's registered to the foundation, and we called it the Scout Youth Trailer, and in theory it was available for all scouting in Port Aransas, and the Webelos, in fact, used it more than the Boy Scouts ever did. But yeah, I bought that trailer from a dealer in Austin and brought it back, and we put solid sides on it. We had a fella, it was a really good artist in Port Aransas, that do some painting on the sides, and that was really quite a slick trailer. And I pulled that trailer myself to Arkansas, to the Buffalo River, and others did the same thing without me. I pulled it up to Big Bend National Park. In more recent years, people also said it was too big a trailer for their automobiles, and we sold that trailer and got a smaller one.
Was all the camping stuff left in the trailer, or was it put in the scout hut?
Well, we left quite a bit of it in the trailer, so you're ready to go.
Like just ready to
hook
go,
on the
hook it up.
trailer, hook on the trailer, go, and even carry a bunch of firewood in there, because a lot of times you get to campsite and there's no firewood there. Yeah, that trailer worked out pretty good in it. And I remember one time we had a Boy Scout camp out up on the Frio River, and boy, it just rained cats and dogs, and everybody's tent was collapsing, and kids all wound up spending the night in that trailer, which was quite dry.
You've got 4 high adventure trips listed. The Buffalo River, Philmont, I think you talked about Philmont a little bit, Big Bend, and Florida sailing.
Yeah, the Florida sailing now is something that was done recently. I wasn't a part of that, but that was a really nice event. I think it was something that Chuck Borders and Art Shanklin and a few others did just 5 or 6 years ago. Philmont, I think Doyle Grundy as scoutmaster took the boys to Philmont 2 or 3 times. I wasn't involved in that, other than that I loaned them my big old green van to go, and Eddie Shepard was one of the older scouts, and he and Doyle drove that van, and they told me at one time they driving along at night and the lights went out. So our Port Aransas scouts were going down the road without any lights, but luckily they came on. And yeah, they had some great adventures in Philmont. There were 2 trips at least to the Buffalo National River with canoes. The Port Aransas, we have our own canoes here, and the first one was made by David Grady and Doyle Grundy and me, and there was a later one made by Chuck Borders and Charlie Zahn. I wasn't involved in that. There were a lot of other canoe trips.
Now,
that have
you
been
also
made.
used the local camp, Camp Caracalla.
Camp Caracalla, sure has been used a lot, and the New Aces, with several canoe trips down the New Aces River right below the dam there at Corpus Christi Lake. You can go down the New Aces River there in canoes.
What would you do at Camp Caracalla? That's on Live Oak Point, right? Is that the one on Live Oak Point?
No, it's near Mathis.
Oh,
near
okay.
Mathis is where the water supply for Corpus Christi is. That's where they have the summer camp for boys up there. And then, so you just go to the lake and they have a lot of
So
activities
it's
there
like
like they do for any summer camp. Let's see, one thing that I think would mention it, talking about Boy Scouts should be that, the first Scoutmaster, when the Scouts got going again in Port Aransas, the first Scoutmaster was Glenn Shaw. And he was Scoutmaster maybe a year or two. And then Don Gibson, who was captain of the Longhorn at that time, and his mate, Ron Musial, became Scoutmaster and Assistant Scoutmaster. And Don had it for a while. And then we were looking for a Scoutmaster, and we asked Johnny Holland, was a researcher down at the Marine Science Institute, and Johnny Holland became Scoutmaster, and he had the troop at a level that we haven't ever seen before or since in Port Aransas. It was really great.
And what years were the 70s?
That was in the 70s. That must have been around 1975 or so, roughly around that time. He had every boy in uniform, and they would go up to Camp Karankawa in the summer camp, and you camp by troops up there, and our Port Aransas troop won just practically every award that they had available up there, and they just almost were, at that time that Port Aransas was like a legend, because he had these boys in Class A uniforms most of the time, and when they went to chow, everybody, usually is you just drag into chow at a certain time. Everybody meets for chow, and you go to chow. Well, Johnny, I don't know if him being an ex-Marine had anything to do with it, but he had all the boys together, uniform inspection, and then you march, counting cadence, or singing some songs. So he had a great troop here in Port Aransas, and they did a lot of camping out. Went up to Big Bend several times, and I thought we were set for many, many years. And doggone, and he had two assistant scoutmasters working with him, both young guys from the Marine Lab, a guy named Mark PAPHA and Ned Smith, a physical oceanographer. And those three guys went up to Philmont, and they have something called Walking Wood Badge, where they go out for a week hiking in the backwoods, and also do all the training for being a scoutmaster. It's a really tough program. And if you finished Walking Wood Badge, you're it so far as a trained scoutmaster. Those three guys from Port Aransas went up there and did Walking Wood Badge, and so I really thought we were set for I don't know how many years, because the three young men, and I'll be darned, within a year, Johnny Holland took a job up in Alaska, and Ned Smith went to Florida. So I left Mark PAPHA, and Mark PAPHA became the scoutmaster, and in less than a year, he had an accident and was tragically killed. He bought a motorcycle, and he was trying to learn how to use it. He was out at the lab and had a helmet on, and somehow he hit the throttle when he meant to hit the brake and catapulted out and hit his head and was killed instantly. And he donated all everything that Mark had in his pickup truck, and everything he owned was donated to Troop 29 at that time. So when Mark was killed, Doyle Grundy had been the committee chairman of the Boy Scouts through all these years, and very active in it. And he had been the assistant Cub master when we got Cubs started. He and Ruth, his wife Ruth, were really big in that. And so Doyle took over as scoutmaster at that time, and so Doyle served, I don't know how many years, but many, many years as Scoutmaster in Port Aransas. He was the Troop 29 Scoutmaster for the longest time there, and was really, really good Scoutmaster. Did a solid job.
Tell us a little bit about merit badges and locations in Port Aransas. For example, Oceanography Days, clearly the merit badge earned at the Marine Science Institute. Was that the only function at MSI that was related to a merit badge? Was the ARC part of that, the Animal Rehabilitation Keep? Is there a merit badge for veterinarian service, or?
You know, there's a merit badge for practically everything you can almost come up with. You know, I don't know, one time we were trying to get counselors, and I signed up for so many you wouldn't believe, like farm, how to locate your outbuildings on your farm, and a few things like that. Somehow I never had a call to do that. But yeah, there are a lot of other conservation badges and such that have people out at the lab have helped. I used to, of course, I would back in the Webelos, we did the aquanaut and could do a lot of things through the aquanaut at the university. And then they had one called the Naturalist, and Rick Tennant in Marine Education Services used to work with us on the Naturalist. Well, we would go out there and Rick would have a bunch of plate glass, and we'd cut it all up and make aquaria. And then we'd go out in the university boats and then collect a bunch of stuff, and the kids bring them back and fill the aquaria up, and we'd go back every week, and he would work with the kids on it. You know, that was a great thing that was done for the boys through the Marine Science Institute.
Was there a merit badge related to the Lydia Ann Lighthouse trip?
Not that I recall. It was mainly something we did for fun, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly something we did for fun. I did have a den chief in the Webelos. When my first den chief was a boy named Todd Platzner. And Todd was first boy after there were many eagles before him in the old days, but he was the first boy to get his eagle in Port Aransas after we reorganized Troop 29. And Todd Platzner was a really great boy who was simultaneously, he was a senior patrol leader of Troop 29, and he was den chief of the Webelos. Then old Todd is since then had a long career in the Air Force and is retired as a lieutenant colonel or colonel, I think. And I know Todd had some requirement in the Boy Scouts that involved might have been his citizenship in the world, and you had to do something for someone from a foreign country. And we managed to do that with a lighthouse tour because we had a student from China at the university. And so got Todd to go ask him if he wouldn't like to go to the lighthouse with us, and Todd could explain to him what was going on. So Todd got his citizenship that way, and this boy from China got a trip to the
Do you have any idea how many eagles there have been in Troop 29?
I recently was looking at a list that had about 10 or 12 on it, and that list did not have any of the old timers on it, which I think were maybe 5 or 6, and I think there were probably another 5 or 6 that I think that list may have stopped soon after my own son stopped with Lathan Thurman, I think. So I'm guessing maybe 25 or 30, something like that.
That's something.
It's not bad for a little town.
Right.
Not bad. I think the best class that we ever had was the class that my son Ethan was in, and David Grady, the assistant scoutmaster's son, was also in that group. And so in one year we had David Grady and Jerry Lee, who was a Chinese boy who later, he got a full scholarship to Stanford, outstanding student at Stanford. Jeffrey Parker.
Oh, yeah.
Jeffrey Parker, and that's 3. And then my son Ethan kind of brought up the rear on that group, and he got his at the last minute, and somebody asked him why did he get his eagle, and he said, well, being my son, it was easier for him to go ahead and do it than it was to not get it. So I don't know if that was much of a compliment or not, but at least he became an Eagle Scout.
Did the Coast Guard become involved in any merit activities with the Scouts, or did they offer resources to you?
Yes. We had Sea Explorers here for a while, and the number 2 man at the Coast Guard station at the time we did that was my assistant leader for the Sea Explorers for those few years. It was only a half dozen years or less that we had Sea Explorers, and he was involved in that. And they always, Coast Guard is really good about hosting a group to go out to tour the station and take us out on their boats for cruise, short cruise.
What year would that have been roughly, the Sea Scout years?
Oh, let's see, that was...
Historians like years.
Yeah, Mark, I think your daughter was in there for a year or 2. I don't know if you remember
Heather?
that. Heather, yeah, because my son Ethan was in there, and they would have been when they were in high school. I know we started before my son was in high school because he wasn't eligible to be a Sea Explorer when we started this Sea Scouts. So
Late 80s?
Late 80s, yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, we had 2 Columbia 22 sailboats that we fixed up, and when they were named the Sam Gampert and the Joe Gampert. And we named them the Sam and Joe because the place where we moored them was in the boat basin, which had been dredged, which if you'd gone back 50 years would have been, or 40 years, would have been the place where Sam and Joe had their tent and their old Chevy van were parked and where they lived. So we named them the Sam and Joe Gampert, and there were a couple of pretty good boats, but that it never did take off. It was, for a short while there, I was even putting out a monthly newsletter, and we were really active in the school shop. Redid one of the boats, and but there, oddly enough, there wasn't enough interest in Port Aransas, and we threw it open to South Texas, and we had more kids, and it was open for boys and girls both. We had more from Rockport and Aransas Pass than we did from Port Aransas.
Well, let me share, Mark and me share some information with you for a minute regarding a program that's just starting in Port Aransas that might be of interest to Sea Scouts in the future. Rick Pratt has just acquired for the museum and for the History Association the last Farley Boatworks building on Avenue A. It was York Air Conditioning, and it was recently the Harley Shop. And Rick Pratt's intention is to, in that building, to give rebirth to the building of Farley boats and the boat building traditions in Port Aransas. And that would be coming underway probably in the next year and a half.
Yeah.
So, share that with you, that's coming up, put the word out.
Yeah, that's real interesting. If I wasn't an old has-been, I'd be interested in that.
Well, I'm sure you're going to be called on that. I'm sure someone's going to ring your number relative to that program.
Yeah.
There seems to be a common thread of leadership coming out of the university for Scouts.
That's true.
Is that because they're just that kind of people that are, or their kids are at that age, or is it something the university's encouraged, or you don't really know? It's just
Yeah, just maybe the scientists have lots of kids, but there's been a big connection, you know. Scoutmasters from the lab and Doyle and Ruth Grundy. Well, Doyle was not there, but
Ruth was.
Ruth, his wife was, and Ruth was a major force in Cub Scouting. And when we first got started, that very first few weeks or months in Port Aransas, Doyle and Ruth had just moved here, and they had been in a real active scouting group in Florida, and they knew a lot. And they put on a training program over in Aransas Pass, and all of us that were just joining went over there, and they trained us and got it started. And Ruth was one of the first den mothers, and Doyle was assistant cub master, and really the cub master because he was training the guy who didn't know a thing, and he would tell him, you know, and Doyle was great as working with cubs because he would do funny things, and that's people are a big failure of Cub Scout leaders is to get too serious. And this guy from the Coast Guard was a young guy, and he took it so seriously, and he was up there just really dragging along, you know, and Doyle would just jump in and do something just funny, crazy, and the kids just loved it. Doyle was great, and kind of taught me how to be a cub master, which is to be a little bit nutty.
We're about 4 minutes on the home stretch, and you've given us such good information for the archives. How would you like to kind of wrap up?
Well, I think we should give a nod to the Jerry McDonald Foundation for one thing, because when we first organized PAC 29 here in Port Aransas, reorganized in the late 70s or early 71, it was a group of citizens that did it, but that was the only year that it wasn't the foundation. The next year, we organized the Boy Scouts, and in the very beginning, when the Boy Scouts was organized, the Jerry McDonald Foundation was the chartered organization for Troop 29, and then when we rechartered the Cub Scouts the next year, the Jerry McDonald Foundation was a chartered organization, and they have been in all these years. And one thing that they've always done for the Scouts is to take care of recharter expenses, which can be quite expensive. So make sure that there's no problem with finances or recharter. The foundation has paid for that recharter for both